Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and we are continuing today with the bell curve. Thank you very much, everybody, for being patient. We did not have an episode last week. I was out of town, so we are picking it back up this week with Chapter 10 from the bell curve, all about parenting, and this section of the book, all dealing with social aspects of IQ, is quickly coming to a close. We don't have that many more chapters here. Just about two. And that will complete this section on cognitive classes and social behavior, and then we move on to part 3. But in this chapter, parenting, we're going to be discussing kind of what makes a good parent. Does IQ play a role in making a good parent? And how do high IQ and low IQ parents affect their children, essentially? And we're going to be doing this strictly based on the graphs from this chapter, because this was a fairly long chapter, 30 pages. And it's nothing compared to chapter 13, let me tell you. But we're going to be going a graph by graph here. So I guess let's go to the first slide. These are the measures that the authors took a look at, comparing maternal IQ and the well-being of the infants. So they also did do comparisons on parental socioeconomic status as well. I found it interesting that they just looked at maternal IQ, and I know that this is, I think from other stuff that I have read, that this is very strongly linked compared to like father's paternal IQ to the child. Obviously, the child grows in the mother, so the mother and the child have this unique bond. But remember from the last chapter, guys, that we did talk about and then like a mother who is not married at birth to a mother who was, maybe not married but was with a partner, a husband, or, a man at the time of birth, and the comparisons between all of those and how important that father figure role was. I'm surprised they didn't do it in this chapter. I kind of would have been interested in looking at that, but these are kind of the measures that we're going to be looking at as far as comparing high IQ and low IQ mothers and the well-being of their infants. And you can take a look at the list there. We'll start off with prenatal care. And what the authors kind of say about this is that most of the women behaved in a similar fashion during the pregnancy. Let me go to that page really quick here. Meaning that really all of them kind of had similar behaviors during pregnancy. They all want to take care of their child, most of them, right? The one thing that was different, alcohol consumption was about the same across the cognitive classes, but smoking was the difference. And I wonder if this has to do with the time period of this survey. I mean, the NLSY, this was the 1990 survey, so I don't know if things were different back then. Like, you're talking almost 30 years ago, right? I don't know if things were, if the studies, the medical studies were quite clear on smoking and when you have like a baby on the way. Because look at that, 51% of women in the bottom two cognitive classes smoked. In the top two was 16%. In the top cognitive class, none of them smoked. And I wonder what that number is today. I don't know. And maybe this is just a sign of the times, but really 1990 does not seem that long ago. That's like within my lifetime. So I don't know. This part of the chapter was very unclear. It seemed that they were just kind of saying, hey, it doesn't matter what your IQ is. Pretty much everybody knows, hey, limit your alcohol consumption. Actually, they didn't even say limit it, but let me take a look at it again. They really didn't say all these mothers know to limit their alcohol consumption. And then they also had this other statistic here on infant mortality. Infant mortality here, and I think I actually have a slide on this, so we'll come back to that later. Let's go to the next graph, and low birth weight. So low birth weight among white babies. Again, this is just for white, like the white population, white mothers, white babies. And look at the table on the left. Incidences of per 1,000 births of low birth weight. What constitutes low birth weight? That I actually, let me see if they said something about low birth weight. Low birth weight baby is defined in these analyses as an infant weighing less than 5.5 pounds at birth, excluding premature babies. Okay. So you can see there, cognitive classes, as you go. That's interesting. Look at the very bright cognitive class. 50 incidences per. There's no real clear. You can't really say that as you go down the cognitive classes that there's a higher incidence of low birth weight. Because look at that very bright class. That's still fairly high. Population average about 62 per 1,000 births, right? But then look at the graph on the right. White mother's IQ has a significant role in determining whether her baby is underweight, while their socioeconomic background does not. If you look at this graph, this tells like an entirely different story. And I think the difference between these two graphs is, or the table on the left, the graph on the right, is that the table in here is controlling for the other variable. Oh, okay. So the graph on the right is controlling for socioeconomic status, right? This is the classic bell curve graph where they're taking a look at IQ, taking a look at socioeconomic status, and holding the other variable constant, right? So in the graph, the probability of being a low birth weight baby decreases as you go from low to high Q. Socioeconomic status barely has anything to do with it, right? Looking at the line, it's almost straight, but shoot, if you go from low to high IQ, your chances of having a low birth weight baby drop by about 5-6%. Nothing staggering here, but there is a slight difference. And maybe that's where there's this. You got to look at this graph carefully because, yeah, there really isn't that much of a difference. You got to look at the y-axis and look at the scale there. You know, it's only going from 0 to 8%. We've seen the other graphs, it goes from like 0 to 25. Similar fashion here, and then you say, oh, wow, that's a pretty big jump. Here, the shape of the graph is the same, right? What I'm trying to say here is you would think that the difference here is large just based on looking at the graph, but you have to look at the y-axis. So you know what? Not very clear here, in my opinion. There seems to be a correlation, but I don't know. It's not much of a difference. Let's move on to infant mortality next. Yes, this is what I was talking about earlier. I did have a slide on this. So there's, again, not real clear data on this one as well. Samples of the NLSY were really, really small. They did mention that there was a 1978 California study in which infant deaths per 1,000 for white women with less than 12 years of education was 12.2. With 12 years of education, it was 8.3. With 13 or more, it's 6.3. Right? So, survey, it seems like the more education you have, the chances of having an infant death decrease. Right? From the 1990 NLSY survey, 42 deaths among children born to women with known IQs. And mothers of deceased children had IQ 6 points less than mothers of surviving children. But the authors are quick to note that the sample size is very, very small. So again, I don't know if you can really say much about maternal IQ and infant mortality. Let's go to the next slide here. Poverty. So a white mother's IQ and socioeconomic background each has a large independent effect on her child's chances of spending the first 3 years of life in poverty. First 3 years in life, I'm wondering why they use that metric. That must be like those first 3 years are just super, super important in like the growth and development of a child. And if you can keep them out of poverty in those first 0 to 3 years, that might have like a staggering effect on how they grow up for the rest of their life, possibly. The link here between IQ and the child growing up in poverty, staggering. So now look at the y-axis here. 0 to 40% with that same curve. So this is why you got to look at the scale here. Because now you're talking about comparing, as you move from very low to very high IQ, your chances are huge in giving your child the best advantage in growing up, right? Keeping them out of poverty. Let's go to the next slide. Home environment. Okay, so what do they mean by home environment? There's this thing called the home index. And what did home index stands for? Home observation for measurement of the environment. So it's a survey. It's meant to basically try and figure out the home environment. I mean, that's kind of what the slide says here, but it's basically there to measure like what kind of environment is your child growing up in. The authors are quick to note here the correlation between the home index and the IQ of white mothers was about 0.24. So they say statistically significant, but hardly overpowering, right? So let's first look at the table. Which white children grow up in the worst homes, right? So percentage of the children growing up in homes in the bottom decile of the home index. And as you move from high to low cognitive class, it increases a decent amount. You go from 0 to 2 to 6 to 11 to 24% in the very dull group, right? And then taking a look at the graph and comparing IQ and socioeconomic status to the chances that the child is growing up in the bottom decile of the home index. Well, the white mother's IQ is more important, according to the graph, than her socioeconomic background. And you can see that from the graph there. The difference as a mother's IQ goes from low to high, percentage chance decreases from, I don't know what you would say that is, 17% to 2%. 2%, yeah. So 15% decrease. Whereas for the socioeconomic status, it's about 6% decrease. Yeah. So not, again, decent. It can make a difference, but you got to figure that there's instances where the mother's IQ is very low and they are still growing up in a great home environment, right? So how about behavioral issues? This is the tale of 3 tables here. The first table, which white toddlers have the worst temperaments? On the left, in the left column, percentage of children. So I'm looking, and just to be clear, I am looking at the leftmost table here, which white toddlers have the worst temperaments. Percentage of children in the most difficult decile on the difficulty index. And as you go from very bright to very dull, you see that, there's a little bit of an increase. Percentage of children in the least friendly decile on the friendliness index. You go from very bright to very dull. Yeah, there's a little bit of an increase. There's a little bit of an increase, but I wouldn't say this is anything like staggering. And how do you exactly measure this? And I would have to believe there's a huge bias in deciding, least friendly and most friendly. Most difficult, least difficult, right? That's subjective. Like what I would say is least difficult, somebody else would say is like, oh no, your child is very, very difficult. And it's like, well, I just think that's just normally how he or she acts, right? So yeah, this is an interesting section. So let's go to the next graph. I'm taking a look at the one right and jumps up to 21%. So again, it's not super clear. And then lastly, the table all the way on the right, which white children are behind in motor and social development. Again, look at the score for the very bright mothers. 10% of children in the bottom decile of the motor and social development index. Very interesting. 10, and then you go to 5%, 6% for bright and normal, and then it jumps up to 32% for the very dull. And I wonder why are you seeing this kind of slight increase in the very bright kind of class? And maybe if it has to do possibly with the fact, if you guys remember, we talked about I forget the chapter. It was a few chapters ago where people today, or at the time of this book and today, the very, very bright, high IQ people are delaying child rearing and marriage, right, till later in life, right? So I wonder if that comes with some possibilities of developmental issues, low birth weight, as we were just talking about, infant mortality possibly. Really, really interesting. Let's continue. And then again, this was a graph, line graph. Both a white mother's IQ and socioeconomic background have moderate relationships with the developmental problems in the child. As you go from low to high in both of those variables, you tend to have a decrease in the probability of your child being in the bottom decile on one of the developmental indicators. Next one, and actually last one, IQ. So IQ in the mother and the child for whites in the NLSY. So kind of class of the mothers. But how do you exactly measure the mean IQ of their children? That's kind of interesting. They do mention here the measure of intelligence we shall be using is the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. They say it's widely measured. But again, that's got to be tough to measure the IQ of a young child. Like, again, is that PPVT test biased? Is it really like the best test of intelligence? That's kind of tough. That's kind of tough. Last column there, percentage of the children in the bottom decile of IQ. So that seems like a staggering difference. Look at that. Go from very bright to very dull. In the very dull, 39% of the children in the bottom decile of IQ. Does that mean they stay there? Does that mean they outgrow it? Well, remember, we have talked about how IQ in your first few years of life definitely it's tough to change that, right? It's you're going to get a good idea of the IQ of the child by looking at the parent's IQ within the first few years of life. Actually, I think that was like after the age of 10. It was something like within the first few years of life, a test does a pretty good job, and then after that time period eclipses and you reach that threshold, I forget if it was like age 10, age 8, and then it becomes more cemented and you tend to resemble the IQ of your parents. So look at the graph on the right. A white mother's IQ dominates the importance of socioeconomic background in determining the child's IQ. And yeah, it is pretty staggering as the mother's IQ goes from low to high. Huge difference there, like about 30% drop in the chance of a child having an IQ in the bottom decile. Right? Socioeconomic background, not a huge factor. Again, that line close to being just a straight horizontal line. Words. And this book is, a lot of it's on about these graphs, right? NLSY surveys, table, and then the corresponding line graph comparing IQ, comparing socioeconomic status, age, etc. I want to read something, though, here before we take off. Children can flourish in a wide variety of environments that are merely okay. But some environments are so bad that no one can seriously dispute that they are bad, and even the most resilient children have difficulty overcoming them. These truly disadvantaged homes are disproportionately associated with women at the low end of the intelligence distribution, even after contributing factors such as poverty, socioeconomic status, are taken into account. Those were the concluding words from the chapter. I think from some of the graphs, very, very clear. From some of the tables, pretty clear. The other ones that we talked about, like low birth weight, infant mortality, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say. I think it does make a difference. Obviously, the higher IQ the mother, it's going to have, I got to believe it's going to have a positive effect. And I think some of the measures here, some of the graphs here did show that, right? And obviously socioeconomic background has a little bit of effect, but as you can see, in some instances, not as much as IQ, not as much. Guys, thank you very much for listening again. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, comments, want to start a discussion, please leave a comment below in the video. We're going to pick it back up next week with Chapter 11 on crime. So that'll be an interesting chapter. This has been Chee-Tash. My name is Chris. Take care.